which aren't really human rights treaties. They're treaties more often not about civil rights. And that's the other confusion we've got. We've got all these justice principles and civil rights principles which are now talked about as human rights without understanding that human rights, like free speech, are universal to everybody. They are sacrosanct principles about the rights of the individuals to own their own bodies, pursue their own opportunities and their enterprise, and we're just conflating all these other things, these societal aspirations, many of which are worthwhile as human rights when they just clearly are not.
James, one thing I wanted to ask you is about people being offended, because I hear a lot these days that people say that offended me, that's outrageous, it's not allowed. And I would have thought that being offended was a good thing. Certainly someone like John Stuart Mill would have thought it was a good thing, because it has the possibility of shaking up your prejudices and making you rethink your approach to the world. Do you think there's a real danger in this new idea that people should be protected from offence?
Well, it's not one I share, and in fact, I think it's Churchill or someone who said there's not a single person who's accomplished anything in his or her life who hasn't been subject to words that offended him or her at some point. As part of a democratic society, you have to grow a thick skin, and that's what, in a way, makes the American culture so powerful, so successful. Going back to the things Tim said, he and I have a different take on human rights, to be totally honest. I am not a natural law guy. I think a lot of these rights are articulated up in such moral abstraction, such broad, vague terms, that they finesse all disagreement. So even something like free speech, I don't think anyone actually says that the right to free speech means you are able to say anything. If someone stands up and counsels murder, we don't allow people to say that. If someone discovered a new biological weapon that would kill everyone on Earth, I would not be in favor of that being on the internet tomorrow. So of course there are limits on speech. And where the disagreement occurs is where you draw these lines. And a lot of the line drawing is open to really reasonable disagreement. And so I don't want a bunch of international people who parade around as elite saying where to draw the lines, and I don't want judges doing it. I think what I want is a vigorous debate amongst our elected leaders. And that's why when you see what happened in Canada, where the politicians actually removed the hate, it makes you feel really good about democracy. When you see this complete collapse of a core principle of Western civilization, this need for free speech to collapse because of why? Because a few special interest groups in Australia say they're offended. Where is the political will on that? And, what's worrying is if they cave in on that and not a single cabinet minister resigns, I'm not clear what a resigning matter is in cabinet in Australia anymore. I mean, okay, you get caught in bed with somebody else's wife or something, but in terms of principle, where do you say this is more important to me than having a chauffeur-driven car? I don't know. I'm so disappointed.
I wonder if also there's the question of who draws the line, because from what you said about Canada withdrawing its hate speech legislation, which sounds like a great thing, but today a lot of censorship is actually enacted not by the government but by groups of people. I'm thinking, for example, of the expulsion of the His Put to Hear speaker from the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, which was won by a group of people campaigning against him on the basis that he was going to commit a hate speech crime, presumably. Do you think censorship is only a problem when it's enacted by the government, or is it also a problem when it's done by self-willed groups of people?
Well, look, if you're an employer, you have no obligation to let people say things that ruin your product. There is a difference between government putting limits on people and a group of people who run a club or who are putting their own money into a project saying, I'm not paying for that. I don't think we have an obligation to invite people over for dinner whose views we don't like. So I do think there is a difference. The government is there for all of us, and the idea of a competition of ideas, that is an idea that pertains to the whole of civil society. If you're a football club owner in the United States and one of your players is saying incredibly racist things, I don't have a problem with you firing the guy. It's your team. You've spent the money. So I think there is a difference.
Okay. Tim, I wanted to explore with you the question of limits to free speech and what limits are acceptable. Where do we draw the line, or do you think there should be no line?
Well, no, there has to be a line, because there is a point, and James went through a bit of it before, about, incitement to violence clearly being a point at which people can't justify certain types of speech. But generally, I think, we have to approach free speech as a blank canvas, and every restriction has to be justified and for exceptional reasons. And that's the problem these days when we talk about it. People actually talk about essentially as though, certain things are acceptable to be said, but everything else is automatically assumed to be outlawed because it hits somebody's hot buttons or upsets people. And so the canvas must be as broad as possible. It must be as open as possible. And there really has to be an exceptional reason. We know why incitement to violence is, because it amounts to an immediate potential harm to people and their own sense of personal security and potential life. But when you're talking about something substantially back from that or vaguer than an explicit incitement to violence, then you can't justify it. And what you actually do is open the door for just about anything to be restricted.
And so do you think one of the problems we face today is the expansion of the definition of incitement and violence to cover more and more forms of speech and actions in life?
Well, no, I'm actually more concerned about even looser terms like hatred. You know, I was reading the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and, you know, that arch right-winger Eleanor Roosevelt was out there advocating against the principle that you should restrict free speech on the basis that it incites some form of racial hatred, because she made the simple point, basically, that this could be interpreted to mean just about anything once the principle's established. And that's what we've had now in subsequent international treaties, which people give their own weight to as they see fit, but that's the term and the basis. And a lot of people argue we should be having restrictions on speech, particularly with relation to matters like discussing race. Our own Prime Minister now talking about hatred as a justification to shut down radical Muslim groups who go out there arguing the case about why the US-led bombing of Iraq is unjustified, as though that's some sort of basis to shut down free speech, which is absurd. It's entirely legitimate opinion, even if I disagree with it strongly.
Not just that, we want to know who these people are. Why do we want to silence them? We want them talking. We want people to know that these views are out there and that they've come into society and they're speaking things like this. Why you want to shut them up? You're not changing their minds. It's a staggeringly bad move.
That's what you do when you try and silence people. Yeah. You are sending a message that this opinion has validity rather than laughing at it and dismissing it.
James, I just wanted to ask you about the proposed attempt to clamp down on more and more radical Muslim groups. Do you think a time of war, such as Australia might consider itself to be in one at the moment or coming to one, is a legitimate time at which to restrict certain forms of speech, or do you think anything goes even in that kind of period?
Look, if I were living during the Blitz in London, I'd be happy with some forms of restriction. I think to some extent depends on the context. But we're not anywhere near there. We're not in what most people would understand as a war. We're in a situation where there could quite likely be some pretty nasty incidents. And I think as a consequentialist calculation, stopping these people from speaking is the wrong way to go about it. If you have people who are trying to tell Germans where to bomb the capital, you might be a little more worried about it. But there's no outside force trying to attack Australia. Right. There are people in the country, and it's a terrible mistake.
Okay, and one quick question for you both. If you had 30 seconds with Tony Abbott, I'm sure Tim often does have 30 seconds with Tony Abbott, what would you say to convince him that freedom of speech is a core important value of Australian society? Tim?
Well, I'd start by just appealing to the political tradition of his own party and highlight that Sir Robert Menzies in his second and third Forgotten People speeches explicitly were on freedom of speech and how important it is and how the contest of debate needs to continue on. But the other important point is to reject special interest groups who have an argument for why you should silence speech, because anyone who wants to govern for the whole of society and the whole of the country has to approach government from broad principles. Sometimes it might seem a bit esoteric and disconnected, but when you get down to it, censorship is a censorship of a human person and their expression and their thoughts, and that is not a healthy thing for society to be doing.
James, what would you say?
Well, I think that listeners need to realize that Tony Abbott is a very smart man. He's a Rhodes Scholar, and he knows these arguments. And I could just dig up all of the speeches he gave before the election and those of his Attorney General Brandis that make all of the points we've made tonight. And for some reason, I don't know if it's raw political calculation or the sense that in governing he's got to worry more about national security. And I would just say, go back and read your own speeches, read the speeches that George Brandis gave, and actually stop and think about what's happening here.
That was Tim Wilson, Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, and James Allan, the Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. And that's it for this week. If you'd like to hear today's programme again, download it or leave a comment, you can. Just go to abc.net.au/Radio National and follow the prompts to Counterpoint. Thank you for your company today. I'm Brendan O'Neill. To play us out today, we have Cardamom Cafe by Cherry Boys. Until next time, goodbye.
After a while, when the sun comes out and I'm feeling fine, I finish my tea and once again I leave the Cardamom Cafe.